Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Paul Burstein, chair of the Jewish Studies program and Pruzan Professor of Jewish Studies as well as Sociology here at the University of Washington. Welcome to the 33rd Annual Samuel and Althea Strom Lectures in Jewish Studies. Several weeks ago at the Seattle Jewish Film Festival, someone I didn't know came up to me and introduced herself. She'd seen me on UW-TV introducing a previous Strom lecture. And we talked about the fact that this year's lecturer would be Professor Michael Walzer, and she was very, very happy to hear that. 20 years ago, as it turned out, she had read one of his important earlier books, Exodus and Revolution, which is a study of the impact of the story of the Exodus on Western political thought, about the ideas that everybody in the West has at some level. When we think about the oppressed, when we think about the deliverance of the oppressed, when we think about movements from slavery to freedom, we think of the Exodus story, and that's what that book was about. Now, it's a very serious academic book. But the person who was talking to me found it not just a serious academic book, she found it inspiring. And in fact, she's used it as the basis for her own Passover Seders for many years since then. And I think that that's a good way of starting a description of Professor Walzer's work generally. It's work of the utmost seriousness on critical topics: war, justice, toleration, democracy, equality. It's work that can be read by ordinary people. You don't have to be a professor. Ordinary people who can find the thinking and their thinking and sometimes even their personal lives very deeply affected by what they read. Professor Walzer got his bachelor's degree at Brandeis University, his PhD at Harvard. He taught at Princeton and Harvard before he became a member of the faculty at the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, where he spent most of his career. He retired nominally and officially became emeritus last July. While he was there, being a professor, he's been very much engaged in public life. He's been a member of the Board of Governors of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a co-editor of Dissent magazine, and a contributing editor to the New Republic, where I've been reading his essays for, I think, probably just over 30 years now. Probably best described as a political philosopher. Among his many books, besides Exodus and Revolution, are Just and Unjust Wars, On Toleration, Spheres of Justice, and Politics and Passion Toward a More Egalitarian Liberalism. A recurring theme in his work is essentially politics in Jewish life and thought, beginning with the Bible. For the past few years, one form this has taken is his co-editorship of a 4-volume series being published by Yale University Press on the Jewish political tradition. Volume 1 on authority, Volume 2 on membership, Volume 3 on community, and Volume 4 on politics in history. Hilary Putnam, an emeritus professor of philosophy at Harvard, has said that the series is unprecedented, enacting a debate that should have a living resonance not just for Jews, although obviously for them, but for everyone with a historical sense and a political conscience. He's also edited the recently published Law, Politics, and Morality in Judaism. Professor Walzer is very clear there, and he'll be very clear tonight and in his subsequent lectures, that he's writing and speaking as a political theorist, not as a traditional religious scholar. In that context, nevertheless, I was especially struck by some things he wrote in the preface to that book, and let me quote. There are two modern answers to what used to be called the Jewish question. I mean, two humane answers. We won't be talking about the other kind. The question itself might be phrased as follows. What political space is there for Jews in the modern world? The first answer points towards citizenship in inclusive democratic states. The second answer points towards sovereignty in the land of Israel. Both of these answers, continuing with what he wrote, both of these answers have now been realized. The process of emancipation brought Jews into democratic states as equal members. A vote at the United Nations and a war of independence brought Jews a state of their own. These two achievements now require the revision and renewal of Judaism generally, and of legal and moral discourse, halakha in particular. The resources available for this work are manifold. First of all, the long tradition of of legal interpretation and controversy, and then the history of the Jews. The discussion, he goes on to say, is already in progress and will continue for a long time, decades, even centuries. What, he asks, is the range of options for thinking about such questions within the religious tradition? In this series of lectures, Professor Walzer will take us back to the beginning. The series title is Biblical Politics, and tonight's lecture is The Meaning of Kingship. We are very honored, delighted, and privileged to have with us tonight Professor Michael Walzer.
Thank you, Paul. It is a great honor to be giving these lectures. I am more than a little in awe of some of the people who have preceded me. And so I think I will begin with a few cautionary words. These lectures are simply a political theorist's reading of the biblical texts. I am not a scholar of the Bible. I don't know the ancient languages. I have only a cheder knowledge of biblical Hebrew. I will read the Bible in the same way as I read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, even though I am not a scholar of 18th century French literature or history. I have studied the books, or some of the books, of the learned men and women on whose territory I am trespassing, but I remain a trespasser. And all of you who read the Bible, all of you who sit through the chanting of the weekly parashah from the 5 books, and the Haftorah from the histories and prophets, or the weekly Bible lesson in your church, all of you should feel free to join this discussion. You have the same basic knowledge that I have. I want to examine 3 different kinds of political agents who figure significantly in the biblical texts: kings, prophets, and elders. If I had a 4th lecture, I would talk about the priests, who play a central role in the history of ancient Israel and who actually rule the nation in the years of the Second Temple. I chose the elders instead for the 3rd of these lectures because I think that the biblical writers' treatment of the eldership has a lot to tell us about their view of politics. It's the view of these writers that I am after in my lectures this week, or better, their views, plural, since there are important disagreements among them. I am not trying to discover what really happened in the years when the Bible was being written, what Davidic kingship was really like, for example, but only what the writers thought about it. I am not going to treat the text as a set of clues to some historical reality that lies behind the text. My subject is only the words on the page as we read them and try to understand them today. In Jewish political thought, from biblical times until the establishment of the modern state, politics and statecraft are discussed, when they are discussed, primarily through the example of kingship. For all practical purposes, there are no other specifically political regimes. Anti-politics appears in different versions in Jewish thought, politics in only one. Writers arguing about the value of the state, the prerogatives of sovereignty, the purpose of political action, consistently refer themselves to the case of monarchy. It is the memory of biblical kingship, along with the experience of living under Gentile kings, that kept alive among exilic Jews the sense of what it means to have a state. And that memory derives from and is sustained by the biblical texts. So in this first lecture, I want to examine the different understandings of kingship that are recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Now, Israel before its kings is most often described as a tribal confederation. And so perhaps it was, though we know from the accounts in the book of Judges how rarely the various tribes fought together against the common enemy. The last war in the book, and the bloodiest, is a civil war. Israel was also a covenantal community, or, following the book of Joshua, an association of heads of families bound by treaty to God and one another. Choose this day which gods you are going to serve, Joshua tells the elders assembled at Shechem, but I and my household will serve the Lord. The other households are immediately pledged to the same service, and this covenant provides the underlying, now broken, now renewed unity of the confederation. Political rule is so radically decentralized that it can hardly be called political. God is the only center. When there were no kings in Israel, God was the king. This period of Israel's history is remembered as an age of heroes, but also as a dangerous time. The successive judges, Gideon, Samson, Deborah, and the others, don't seem to have occupied anything that can be called an institutionalized office. Titles change, individuals come and go. There are no authorized succession. There's only the intermittent, varying sway, writes Max Weber, of the charismatic war heroes. That the covenant of family heads and the confederation of tribes survived for 200 years with leadership of this sort is testimony to divine favor or rare good luck. The kingship of God over Israel seems to have coincided with the eclipse of empire in Egypt and Assyria. A decentered Israel faced only local enemies. But one of these, the Philistines, organized as a confederation of cities, finally succeeded in dominating most of the hill country that the Israelites had conquered or into which they had infiltrated 2 centuries earlier. According to the biblical story, Philistine triumph and Israelite disunity brought on the crisis out of which monarchy emerged. The story is told in the first book of Samuel, chapter 8, and it is a famous story, the beginning of the long debate over the virtues of kingly rule. There's no written evidence of any similar debate in Egypt or Mesopotamia or among the Canaanites or Philistines. Even the Greek discussions about the best regime lie far in the future. In all the countries of the ancient Near East, in or around the year 1000 before the Common Era, monarchy is regarded as the divine or natural form of government. The king is a god or a deputy or servant of the gods, connecting politics to nature, the state to the cosmos, ensuring the fertility of the fields and the reproduction of humankind. So when the elders of Israel come to Samuel, the currently established judge and seer, and ask him, quote, to make us a king, to rule us like all the nations, to rule us like all the nations, the request is impossible in this important sense. The fact that the people imagine a king being made at their request means that he can't be like the kings of the other nations. And Samuel demonstrates how different the making of this king will be by disputing the request. Both the request and the dispute have a precedent. In Judges chapter 8, the men of Israel come to Gideon, who had just led them in a successful war against the Midianites, and say, "Rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's son also." Kingship is not mentioned here, but the emphasis on the succession makes the point. As it is understood in Israel, kingship is the successive rule of fathers and sons. The contrasting regime is the intermittent rule of leaders raised up by God. Gideon's response affirms the contrast. I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you, the Lord shall rule over you. This is to remind the men of Israel of the commitment that makes them Israelites. Gideon addresses them as men of the covenant. Now, Samuel might have responded similarly had he himself been asked to become king. Faced with an impersonal request for a new regime, he attempts what is perhaps a more politic and certainly a more secular response. He addresses the elders as fathers of families and describes the consequences of submitting themselves to the father of a particular family. He will take your sons and daughters into his service, Samuel says, and appoint them to be his horsemen, to run before his chariots, to reap his harvest, to make his instruments of war, to be his cooks and bakers. And he will tax you for his own benefit, seizing your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them. And ye shall be his servants, as you were the servants of Pharaoh before you became the servants of God, free among your fellow men. But the elders are not persuaded. Freedom is too dangerous. They want the security of an established succession, and they are willing to pay the price and allow one household, initially like all the others, to become a royal court. It isn't that they think naively that the king won't behave, as Samuel predicts. Saul and David are, after all, men like themselves. And the extraordinarily realistic account of the successive royal courts was written, presumably, with Israel's elders in mind. In a sense, the rabbis were right centuries later when they declared, all that is set out in the chapter of a king, that's chapter 8 from Samuel, all that is set out in the chapter of a king, he is permitted to do. The people have been warned, and they or their representatives have agreed. Therefore, the behavior predicted by Samuel is permissible, even though neither Samuel nor the God with whom he speaks believes that it is necessary, and the writers who produced Samuel's warning were surely not royalists. The rabbis say, God said to Israel, I planned that you should be free from kings. The elders had a different plan, but that doesn't mean that they intended to enslave themselves to the kings into whose service they had voluntarily entered. They were prepared to give the king sufficient power to establish a permanent army, but they were as protective of their households as Samuel thought them to be. And so when Solomon conscripted too many of their children, not only for war, but also for massive construction projects, when he turned the royal corvée into something like a levy en masse, he put his succession at risk. Representatives of the northern tribes bargained with his heir, Rehoboam, demanding that he promise, quote, to make the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke which he put upon us lighter. And when Rehoboam refused to do that, the households of the north deserted the royal household, repeating the battle cry of an earlier rebellion, what portion have we in David? Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. The north turned to Jeroboam, who had been one of Solomon's officials, and called him into the congregation and made him king over all Israel. They made him king, as if to say that they would serve him only so long as he served them. We may take the Deuteronomic law of kings as the final outcome within the biblical story of the debate that Samuel began and of the rebellions that were its practical expression. The text from Deuteronomy 17 can be read as a reflection on Samuel's warnings and Solomon's enactments, but it is also a constitutional text, the first formal description of a limited monarchy. With the adjoining verses on judges and priests, it's the first formal description of a state, a very rudimentary state, no doubt. Still, it comes close to standard political science definitions. Here is a centralized monarchy with a set of appointed officials, which collects taxes, conscripts its subjects, builds fortresses and temples, wages war, and negotiates alliances. When the people of Israel are called stateless after the exile, this is the state that they have lost. The monarchy was also the central focus of critics and reformers. The authors of Deuteronomy are royalist reformers. They recount the initial request of the elders, permit, and some say command, the setting up of a monarchic regime, and then establish a set of limits on kingly rule designed to rule out grievous service and heavy yokes. These are the words of Deuteronomy. But he shall not multiply horses to himself, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold, that his heart be not lifted above his brethren. In other words, the king is not to expand his household or increase his power or wealth, this is the reading of the rabbis of the Talmudic period, beyond what is required for the performance of his duties. The reiterated phrase, to himself, suggests that what is at issue here is personal and dynastic aggrandizement. The authors of Deuteronomy want a king who will judge the people and lead them when necessary into battle and do nothing more. They are not all that different from the elders who first came to Samuel, but they write after the experience of Solomonic kingship. Perhaps they mean to repudiate imperial warfare, for horses stand in here for chariots, and chariots were the tanks of the ancient world. This is Max Weber's view. The Deuteronomists believe, he writes, that the source of all evil was the transformation of the state into an Egyptian house of bondage in connection with chariot combat and world politics. The medieval commentator Nachmanides took a similar view. And this is a wonderful sentence. You will set a king over you like all the nations that surround you, only he should not be like their kings. For the main desire of kings is to increase horses and horsemen for themselves. Deuteronomy seeks to constrain the king's ambition, but it establishes no institutional limits on his power. There is no council of elders described in the text whose consent he must seek. There is no set of judges, no court that can overrule his decisions. Nonetheless, he is a king unlike the others. His elevation is purely practical and instrumental. The relation between the Hebrew monarch and his people, writes Henry Frankfurt, was as nearly secular as is possible in a society where religion is a living force. Indeed, the argument that I have just rehearsed is entirely secular, but it is shadowed by two religious arguments, one rejecting and the other exalting monarchic rule. I have set these aside for the moment in order to stress the most remarkable feature of Israelite kingship, the absence of cosmological significance. The king is a human artifact made by the people for their own purposes. That's why awe and reverence are absent from 1 Samuel. The Hebrews knew, I'm quoting Frankfurt again, the Hebrews knew that they had introduced kingship on their own initiative and under the strain of emergency. It was a political solution to political problems. The emphasis on making should remind us of the work of 16th and 17th century state builders who often quoted these biblical texts. But there were many Israelites, beginning with Samuel himself, who resisted this political solution. And not only because they were worried about their sons and daughters, they had religious reasons for rejecting monarchy. The more radical resistance came from men who felt themselves chosen by God to rule Israel at his direct command, whose central claim is put by God himself. When Samuel complains to God about the request of the people for a king, God responds, "They have not rejected thee," he tells Samuel, "but they have rejected me, that I should not rule over them." In fact, the two rejections are simultaneous and identical. God's rule can only be overthrown by overthrowing his designated agents, and when his agents are overthrown, so is he. Israel had been, and so Samuel thought should have remained, a theocracy, ruled by God's servants, solitary figures without family ties, raised up only for a time. This is a minority position in the next 4 or 5 centuries. It is only revived when a new understanding of divine service is worked out, first among the priests after the Babylonian exile, and then among the sages after the destruction of the Second Temple. In the monarchic period, the theocratic view is expressed only occasionally. The theocratic rejection of monarchy is expressed only occasionally by one or another of the prophets. They have set up kings, says Hosea, in God's name, but not by me. Kings live under a shadow in biblical Israel because God is the only true king. It isn't easy to understand the kingship of God. This is a regime without archives. All we have are stories, like the Samson stories, which read like folk tales, but no official records, no court chronicles. In practice, God's rule made for a kind of anarchy. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. This reiterated line, I think it appears 3 or 4 times in the book of Judges, this reiterated line, "Every man did what was right in his own eyes," was no doubt intended by the king's supporters as an indictment. And yet the picture presented in Judges is not, until the end at least, wholly unattractive. A community of covenanted men, heads of families, peers, responsible for their own and each other's conduct, rescued by God only when they get into trouble, otherwise left to their own devices. This could as easily be a utopian as a dystopian picture. But the stories are too brutal, the civil war at the end of the book too bloody, to make the kingship of God and the rule of judges raised up by God an attractive option. Theocracy, in my view, is not a political regime, but perhaps the biblical writers thought of it that way. And if they did, we have to say that for the main line of writers, despite their religious commitment, it was not the best regime. The transition from judges to kings is nonetheless remembered as a rejection of God. Despite the work of royal scribes, there survives in the biblical text an account not only of the elders' request for a king, but also of Samuel's condemnation of the request, and even of the elders' later acknowledgement that they had added to all their previous sins this evil, to ask us a king. the idea that God's rule is better than the rule of kings survives the actual experience of God's rule and reappears again and again in Israel's history. This survival probably accounts for the failure of monarchy to achieve full cosmological status. Kings may serve human purposes, perhaps even human necessities, but they are only dubiously servants of God. At least this is one of Israel's political or anti-political traditions. There is, of course, another tradition, assiduously cultivated by the kings themselves, immensely popular, with a long post-monarchic afterlife, according to which kings are indeed God's servants and even something more. And this I will call the high theory of monarchy. It is probably the work of scribes, priests, and prophets. We know neither their names nor their social roles, attached to Solomon's or more likely to some later king's court. The theory is read back to the time of David, though David's presentation of himself as king was cautious and, relative to his sons, unpretentious. Chosen by God and anointed by Samuel, he was also confirmed and anointed by the elders. So all the elders of Israel came to Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. Covenanted with the elders, he was bound by their traditions, hence his inability to build a temple in Jerusalem. The God of the Old Covenant had never dwelt in a house, so the prophet Nathan tells David, but had walked in a tent and a tabernacle. The portable ark was the most important religious symbol of the decentralized kingship of God. And Frank Cross, the Harvard historian, is surely right to say that the insistence on this old symbolism was directed against the Canaanite ideology of kingship, which developed immediately with the building of the temple. In fact, as Cross has shown, this Canaanite ideology was mediated by a new version of Israelite ideology. It had to be naturalized into the covenantal tradition, a process that set limits on the development of Canaanite royalism. The crucial mediating idea was the covenant itself, now transformed from a conditional pact between God and the people of Israel to an unconditional pact between God and the house of David. This transformation is the subject of lively scholarly debate, and I shall offer only a simplified account. Most scholars agree, at least on this, that conditionality is the earlier idea. The Sinai covenant has the form of an if-then mutualism. If you keep my commandments, God tells Israel, you will live in peace and prosperity in the land to which I will bring you, and if not, not. This conditionality is then acted out. The people fail to keep the commandments, and God punishes them, sometimes directly with plague and fire, more often indirectly with military defeat. But he does not abandon them. After every episode of transgression and punishment, the old relationship is restored. So at least goes the account in the history books, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And it suggests that early on, some notion of a permanent tie, eternal divine love for Israel, must have figured in the covenantal tradition. But the emphasis, still in Deuteronomy, for example, with its blessings and curses, the emphasis was on conditionality. Solomon's servants, or Hezekiah's servants, or some group of royalist writers, invent an alternative tradition. Appropriately, they trace it back to Abraham rather than to Moses, for they mean to describe a covenant in which the people have only a secondary part. First place is assigned to patriarchs and kings. What God promises now is less importantly peace and prosperity for Israel than an endless succession for Abraham and David. There is still a shadow of the old conditionality, but the emphasis has clearly changed. This is the promise to David, as set forth in one of the royal psalms, Psalm 89, written probably to be chanted in the Jerusalem temple. And I'll read a long section of Psalm 89. And it's about the king. I will set his hand, and God is speaking, I will set his hand upon the sea, his right hand upon the rivers. I will appoint him firstborn, highest of the kings of the earth. I will maintain my steadfast love for him always. My covenant with him shall endure. I will establish his line forever, his throne as long as the heavens last. If his sons forsake my teaching and do not live by my rules, if they violate my laws and do not observe my commands, I will punish their transgressions with the rod, their iniquity with plagues. But I will not take away my steadfast love from him. I will not violate my covenant or change what I have uttered. His throne shall continue forever, his throne as the sun before me and as the moon established forever, an enduring witness in the sky. Now that's a very strong argument, and it's further strengthened by the witness of sun and moon, deities, to Israel's neighbors, though the psalmist is careful to avoid implications of divinity here. His treatment of other Canaanite themes is similar, cautiously trespassing on forbidden ground. I will set his hand upon the sea, his right hand upon the rivers, suggests without quite saying that the gods of sea and river have been defeated by the Lord's anointed. I will appoint him firstborn, makes David and then Solomon divine sons, but only by adoption. Another psalm is more forthright. This is from Psalm number 2. The Lord said to me, you are my son. I have fathered you this day. Even these lines claim only a post hoc fathering, divine sonship without direct divine descent. But the meaning is clear enough. All the other men of Israel are the fathers of their own sons. The king is the son of a heavenly Father. These psalms reassert, but also embellish, the covenantal relationship. Embellished in this way, however, the covenant and the monarchy it establishes take on a radically new character. The king's family is no longer one among many. It now replaces the others, at least in this sense that Israel's history is mediated through it alone. Insofar as the high theory of kingship is successful, the king stands in for the people who suffer for his sins and are more rarely rewarded for his righteousness. When the prophets castigate the people as a whole, rather than the king alone, they are abandoning the high theory. When the author or final editor of the second book of Kings focuses narrowly on the sins of King Manasseh, he is writing the high theory into the historical record. He writes, of course, with the assurance that even a bad king like Manasseh, since he is David's heir, will have heirs of his own to whom God will remain committed. We can best grasp the full meaning of this new doctrine if we look again at the Deuteronomic law of kings. Deuteronomy is thought by many scholars to be later than the Psalms I have quoted, but it probably represents the view of the Israelites who first asked for a king, and also of those other elders who deposed Solomon's son. The account of the law ends with a statement of its purpose, and I read you the first part of this, that his heart be not lifted above his brethren, and that he turn not aside from the commandments to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. This is no promise of prolonged days, only a hope and a program. The medieval commentator Rashi is certainly right to see here the old if-then argument. I'm quoting Rashi now, "From the positive statement you may derive the negative, and so indeed do we find in the case of Saul." On this view, there can't be a guaranteed succession, for each king will be judged by his own performance. The high theory also holds that David's heirs will be judged, even chastised, with plagues and wars, but it insists that the succession is eternal. Each individual king partakes in the mystery of permanence, divine favor, adoptive sonship, mythic triumph. So what happens when the succession fails? The seizure of King Jehoiachin by the Babylonians in 597, and then the blinding and exile of Zedekiah, whom they had set up in his place, brings the Davidic dynasty to an end. After that, God's steadfast love for the house of David is nowhere in evidence. Zerubbabel, a later grandson or great-grandson of the last king, may have harbored hopes for a restoration after the return from Babylonia. If he did, his hopes were vain. He seems to have had a hand in rebuilding the temple, and then abruptly and without explanation, he disappears from the biblical record. But David's line lived on in Israel's imagination. And eventually, the high theory of monarchy found expression in one of the versions of prophetic messianism. How this came about, I can't explain here. I probably can't explain it at all. It is enough to say that messianism is the heir of mythic kingship, just as the Messiah himself will be the heir of the house of David, the adopted son of God. For many centuries, Israel's political hopes were focused on this figure who would come in God's good time, the fulfillment of his promise. There were occasional attempts to force the end, to impose a messianic regime, and perhaps a failed attempt of this sort accounts for Zerubbabel's disappearance. But messianism is, most of the time, a politics of passivity and postponement, as Gershom Scholem has argued, an apolitical politics. With the advent of the monarchy, the royal household replaced the people as the carrier of Israel's history. In the afterlife of monarchy, the people wait quietly for the miraculous return of David's heir. But this apolitical ending is not the whole story of Israelite kingship. In fact, the critical moment when the elders come to Samuel is the dawn of political understanding in Israel. If we think of politics as a form of human coping with the problems of individual and group coexistence, then Israel's politics until then had been preempted by God himself, who supplied judges to the people and fought directly on their behalf. As the song at the sea says, "The Lord is a man of war." So what need is there for ordinary soldiers, or for military or political self-reliance? The reduction of Gideon's army to a tiny band is designed by the writer of the book of Judges to make just this point: lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, says God, saying, "Mine own hand hath saved me." To be saved by God's hand is undoubtedly a sign of favor, but it also represents a loss of political control. And how can Israel count on divine assistance when it stands so often in violation of divine law? In any case, God's interventions are intermittent and long delayed. He waits until the last possible minute. When the elders ask, what the elders ask of Samuel is a different kind of government, visibly embodied in a king, institutionalized in a royal court and an army, stabilized through hereditary succession. The vesting of authority in one family is at the same time a collective seizure of power from God himself, a replacement of charisma by politics. The result is a special kind of normality, man-made rather than natural or divine, subject therefore to an ongoing critique, but normal nonetheless. Israel's kings face the same realities as other kings, and they must attempt some reasonable accommodation. Henceforth, with the establishment of monarchy, God's interests are represented by his prophets, while the often contradictory set of human interests, personal, dynastic, and national, are represented by the king. Prophecy is born together with monarchy, lest divine law have no voice in the world. And this double birth sets up the central conflict of the new regime, usually construed as a conflict between royal immorality and prophetic admonition, as in the famous cases of David and Bathsheba, Ahab and Nabot. The prophet facing down the king obviously in the wrong, penitent like David, or irrevocably condemned like Ahab. This is what we have been taught to expect from prophets and kings. Prophecy is at war with personal and later on with social wrongdoing. But prophecy is also at war, as God is at war, with politics itself. Not only when politics is a form of self-aggrandizement, but also when it is a form of self-help. The clearest example of this latter opposition the clearest examples come from the experience of war. The elders, remember, wanted a king to go out before us and fight our battles. But it is also the responsibility of kings to avoid battles when that is possible and to make peace when battles end. The earliest conflict of king and prophet is brought on by Saul's refusal to kill the Amalekite ruler Agag after a successful war. Here Samuel, in the role of a prophet, upholds the laws of holy war, which require the extermination of the enemy. Saul opposes the holy war for reasons that remain obscure until the opposition is repeated by Ahab in a war against the Syrians. Ahab's position is clear. He spares the Syrian king and his people for the sake of peace. King Ben-Hadad is called brother by Ahab, and as soon as the battle is over, they enter into negotiations. And this is the biblical text from 1 Kings chapter 20. And Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram or Syria, said unto him, "The cities which my father took from your father I will restore to you. And you shall make markets for yourself in Damascus, as my father made in Samaria." And then said Ahab, "I will send thee away with this covenant." And so he made a covenant with him and sent him away. An unnamed prophet condemns this sensible behavior, claiming that God had appointed the Syrians to utter destruction. Ahab has a better idea. Acknowledging that Israel had not been destroyed by Ben-Hadad's father, he seeks only a limited victory over the son. This is the politics of reciprocity and accommodation, and it represents the triumph of the elders. Israel is indeed a nation like other nations when its kings call other kings brother. So monarchy is a form of normal state politics, while the prophets defend abnormality, which is sometimes admirable and sometimes not. The opposition is reenacted again and again. When Solomon marries strange women, that is, the daughters of foreign princes, builds them shrines, and permits them to burn incense and sacrifice unto their gods, he is neither defending religious toleration nor advocating idol worship. He is simply pursuing what must again have seemed a sensible and was certainly a conventional foreign policy, aiming at peace with his neighbors. Royal marriage was a political rather than a personal alliance. But Solomon is condemned by the prophets and later on by the Deuteronomic historians. And similarly, when the last kings of Israel, a motley crew of usurpers and murderers, seek alliances with Egypt or Assyria, they are acting as the weak must act in the company of the strong. Every actual alliance entailed risks, no doubt, but it was hardly foolish to think that the risks of relying on divine intervention, as contemporary prophets demanded, were even greater. And not only because of the moral character of these particular kings. Necessity must be served, and kings exist for just that service. That kings defend politics against God's law is likely to seem to us a Machiavellian idea, the product of religious, perhaps also of moral skepticism. It is, in fact, a biblical idea, but it is reported in negative terms from the side of God and not the side of the king, and there is only grudging recognition of its realism. That's the upshot, surely, of the argument in Samuel, as it has come down to us, that kings have their purposes and value, even though they are likely to behave badly. The biblical authors and editors hope at the same time, of course, for a perfect king. David is the model, despite his imperfections. A king who will not resist, but enact the law. In Deuteronomy 17, the king is commanded to write out or have written out a copy of the law and to read therein all the days of his life. The covenant between king and God is meant to sustain this commitment. The king promises to keep the divine statutes, to do them. But the king is also covenanted with the people who made him, at least on one Israelite understanding of kingship, and the implicit law of this covenant is salus populi suprema lex. The well-being of the people is the supreme law. That maxim has no biblical equivalent. The authors of the book of Samuel seem to sense the possible tension between public well-being and divine rule, but this is not a subject of reflection among our writers. So, a very quick summary. Kingship arises in Israel as a practical response to the failures of theocratic rule. The high theory of kingship, with its myths of divine sonship and unconditional covenant, comes later. It represents a royal effort to escape the practicalities, and the escape is so successful that the house of David survives the death of its last son and lives on in impractical, apolitical, messianic fantasy. The kingship that the elders asked of Samuel thus stands precariously between theocracy on one side and messianism on the other. The charismatic judge comes at the last minute to save the people. The Messiah comes at the end of time. But the king and his sons are engaged month after month, year after year. They exist in what we might call the space of secular time, which is the space of normal politics, and also the space within which the state takes shape. Insofar as there is any recognition of an autonomous political realm in biblical thought, it has its beginning and perhaps its only location here in the history of Israel's kings. Thank you.